Hi, good evening, everyone. Over the course of the Daf Yomi that we're learning now, which is Maseches Brachos, it's really a thrill because every single daf is has at least one, usually more than one, very fascinating sugya of halacha that is both interesting and relevant to everyday life. And on Daf Yud Ches, which was yesterday's daf, we had an interesting sugya about the halacha called Loeg Larash. And so the name of tonight's shiur is Dead People Have Feelings Too, the halacha of Loeg Larash. And as we'll see, Loeg Larash is a halacha that tells us we have to be sensitive to the feelings of the deceased. And we'll see exactly how that manifests itself in halacha. We'll go through the source text in the Gemara and Brachos, and then we will look at some sections of Shulchan Aruch where the halacha of Loeg Larash is mentioned numerous times throughout Shulchan Aruch. And then we'll take a look at two very interesting tshuvas, one from the Maharsham, of Shalom Shwadron, of the early 20th century, and then we'll take a look at an interesting tshuva from Reb Moshe as well. The Gemara in Brachos Daf Yud Ches Amud Aleph says, Meso u'mishamro in aval mahalech beveis hakvaros lo. We're coming in the middle of a discussion where the Gemara has just established that if you have a relative that has passed away and you're an oning, or if you're watching over the deceased, if you're a shomer, let's say for the Chever Kadisha, in those two instances, you're patur from Kriya Shema. You don't recite Kriya Shema. But it sounds like from the Gemara that we can infer from this that if you're only proximal to a corpse, then you would be permitted to recite Kriya Shema. It's perfectly fine, because you're neither a relative of the deceased, nor are you doing Shmira, you just happen to be within the proximity of the corpse. So the Gemara says, but that's refuted from the following brisa. V'hatanya, lo yahalich adam beveis hakvaros, a person may not walk in a cemetery, utfilin barosho b'sefer Torah bizra'o v'korei. And he's not allowed to have tefillin on his head while he's in the cemetery, nor can he have a sefer Torah in his bosom reading from that sefer Torah. V'im osekein over mishum loeg larash cheref osein. And if he does so, he violates the statement in the book of Proverbs which says that he scoffs at the rush, at the lowly one. And here the Gemara says that's a reference to a person who can no longer fulfill mitzvahs. You're basically mocking or snubbing your nose at someone who is buried right nearby where you're walking, and you're showing off, you're saying, ha ha ha, I can recite Kriya Shema, I can wear tzitzis, I can wear tefillin, and you can't because you're 6 feet under, you no longer have the ability to perform mitzvahs anymore. And that, says the Gemara, is not proper. It's a halachic imperative that we not hurt the feelings of those who can no longer fulfill mitzvahs. Hasam, so the Gemara says, if that's the case, then why is the implication of our previous Gemara only that if you're an onen, you're a shomer, you don't recite Kriya Shema? It would seem that even if you're neither of those, but you're just within the proximity of a corpse, you also may not recite Kriya Shema. So the Gemara answers, Hasam toch arba amos uda aser, chutz la arba amos chayev. Answers the Gemara that it's true that there's a prohibition of Loeg Larash, but only when you're within 4 amos, 4 cubits of the deceased. If you're further away from the deceased, then you have a mitzvah and you're able to recite Kriya Shema and do all of those other mitzvahs. Whereas if you're a shomer, you're an onein, even if you're further away from the corpse, you still have an exemption from reciting Kriya Shema. The Omar Mar, as the teacher taught us, Meis tofes arba amos l'Kriya Shema, that a corpse basically acquires a radius of 4 cubits as far as basically creating a zone where no one may recite Kriya Shema within that radius. And hacha chutz la'arba amos nami poter. But in our discussion, which we've been talking about, a shomer or an onein, you're going to be exempt from Kriya Shema even if you're further away from the corpse. We skip a few lines in the Gemara, and the Gemara then resumes its discussion of this prohibition called Loeg Larash. Amar Rach ba Amar Rav Yehuda. Kol haroeh hameis ve'enu milavehu over mishum loig larash cheref osehu. Now this is a corollary of what we've just stated before. If the principle of loig larash is not to mock or not to do anything that would be offensive to the deceased, then a corollary of that is that if you see a funeral procession passing before you, then you have an obligation to stop whatever you're doing and to follow along with the funeral procession out of respect for the deceased. And if you don't, if you neglect to do so and you continue playing golf or whatever you've been doing, you know that famous story about the guy who's on the 8th hole and he sees the funeral procession passing by. Finish the joke, Craig. You must know it already, right?
It's my wife.
Right. Well, basically, the punchline is, because everyone sees him, standing at attention and stopping his game, he says, well, it's the least I could do for my wife, But anyway, but the obligation is to stop whatever you're doing and follow the funeral procession, and if not, you violate the halacha of loig larash. And if you do stop whatever you're doing and you properly escort the deceased, what is your reward? Amar Avasi, alav hakasav oimer malaveh Hashem or milaveh Hashem chonein dal. That a person who is kind or respectful to the lowly, referring to the deceased, is tantamount to one who escorts God himself. Meaning that escorting the deceased is tantamount to escorting HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. So therefore it's a very, very prestigious, it's a very great thing to do. It's the same principle from another text in Mishlei. Now let's look at the next story. Rabbi Chia v'Rabbi Yonasan havushakli va'azli b'veis akvaras. These two great sages, Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yonasan, were once walking through a cemetery. Hava kashadja techelta de Rabbi Yonasan. Rabbi Yonasan's tzitzis were quite long, and they were schlepping along on the ground to the point where they were actually probably touching either the tombstones or the earth where the graves were actually resting. Amarle Rabbi Chia dalye. So Rabbi Chia said, Rabbi Yonasan, come on, lift up your tzitzis. Kedei shelo yomru lamacher ba'in atzleinu ve'achshav mecharfinosan. So that the dead should not, in an accusatory way, say, look at these people. Tomorrow they'll be joining us, and today they're mocking us or making fun of us by gloating and overtly, openly displaying that they can wear tzitzis and we cannot wear tzitzis. Amarle umiyadi kulehai. So Rabbi Yonasan says back to Rabbi Chia, come on, Rabbi Chia, since when do the dead know what's going on? What do you think they care about what's going on? You think they are conscious of what we're doing above the ground in this world? Doesn't it say in Koheles that the dead know nothing? They're oblivious to what's going on in this world. Amarle, Reb Chia said to him, Im karis lo shanis, im shanis lo shilasht, im shilash lo pirshulach. Reb Chia says, I'm sorry, Reb Yonasan, you misunderstand that pasuk. If you studied it once, you didn't review it. If you reviewed it, you didn't review it a second time. And if you reviewed it and you studied it 3 times, then and you still interpret it this way, it must be that you were never taught the pasuk correctly. And then Reb Chia exposits on the true meaning of the pasuk, which has nothing to do with the dead not knowing about what's going on, but rather it refers to the wicked, who even in their lifetimes are considered to be like dead people, and they are ignorant of what reality is all about. That's really what the pasuk in Koheles is referring to, according to Rabbi Chia. The Gemara continues for over an entire Amud of going back and forth, discussing whether or not the dead know what's going on. One of the last statements of the Gemara that we learned actually this morning on Daf Yotes Amud Aleph in Brachos is that the Gemara has 2 different opinions as to whether or not the dead are aware of what's going on. One opinion is that if you disparage someone who has passed from this world, it's like disparaging a rock. Just like the rock is oblivious, so too the deceased are oblivious to what you're saying about them. Another opinion is that they are very well aware of what you say about them if you disparage them, But they simply don't care. Because why should we care if once we're in the Olam HaEmes, what some zhlub is talking about us in this world? That's the attitude of the Gemara. Yeah? Now, I mentioned at the Daf Yomi Shir yesterday that Rav Dessler quotes from a Sefer Yaros Devash, which demonstrates from the equivocation of the Gemara that this seems to be like an Ibaya de lo Ipshita. It seems to be like a question that was never fully answered. The Gemara never comes to any true resolution as to whether the dead are aware of what's going on in this world or not. There are certain Gemaras which indicate that the dead are fully aware of what is going on in this world. And there are other Gemaras and Midrashim which indicate that the dead are not aware. Like, for example, HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to tell Yirmiyahu Hanavi, he said to him, go wake up the Avos, go wake up the patriarchs and let them know that I'm destroying the Beis HaMikdash. So Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were not aware that Hashem was destroying the temple? The answer is no, they were not. They were totally oblivious. So how do we reconcile this? Says the Yaros Devash that both are true. Elu ve'elu are true. It all depends on the individual. If the individual was someone whose sole focus in life, or whose primary focus in life, was Olam Hazeh, were the pleasures and the features of this world, so then even after one passes from this world, they continue to remain interested. If your passion in life is hockey, then after you die, your passion in life will still be hockey. You'll still want to know what the score is, how the Maple Leafs are doing. And good luck with that. Right? But if your passion in life, if your primary interests in life are spiritual affairs, so then once you leave this world, you lose interest in what is going on in this world. And your neshama, your disembodied soul, once it goes up into the Olam HaEmes, really does, in a sense, detach itself from the interests and affairs of this world. So one, therefore, if one has a truly holy parent or grandparent, they shouldn't feel bad if they haven't received the communication from the deceased parent or grandparent. And I say this in all seriousness, because the very fact that the individual who's passed from this world has detached himself or herself from this world is an indication that they were spiritually minded, so that once they had the opportunity to become disembodied, they didn't turn back and they kept moving forward.
So yeah. The idea of a Melitz Yosher, the whole idea is that we want them to take our tefillas and to carry our tefillas.
Right. So a Melitz Yosher could be, in a sense, a deceased ancestor who has zechuyos that act on your behalf. And they may not, that Melitz Yosher who's in Shamayim, in the Masifta Durakiya, in the heavenly yeshiva, may be intensely studying and focusing on the divine presence, but at the same time is aware that they have progeny that needs zechuyos, so that person will daven and will put in a good word for us. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they will intercede or be involved or take an interest in what is going on in this world. They may not. They may be totally oblivious, but at the same time, our tefillos will come to them. They'll somehow be touched by our tefillos to be aroused and be awoken to daven for us, without necessarily being aware of what's going on in our lives. Perhaps that's the way you have to look at it. I don't claim to understand the model completely, but it's important to appreciate that because of the fact that the Gemara really doesn't resolve this issue, indicates to us that this is a multifaceted concept. It's a multifaceted phenomenon that has many aspects of truth to it. There's no one correct answer to this question of what knowledge do the dead have of what's going on in this world. Now I want to get back to this halacha of loeg larash, because at face value, if a person is purely a rationalist, you would say that, well, this prohibition of loeg larash, don't walk into a cemetery and recite Kriya Shema, because it's insensitive. And perhaps there's an ethical Musar teaching over here, having nothing to do with the reality of whether the dead know what's going on in this world or not. Perhaps all it merely is indicative of, like I put in this little box for consideration, we know that there's a principle that we learn in Musar that we have to be sensitive even to inanimate, unknowing, non-sentient beings. For example, we know that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought the first of the 10 plagues, when he brought the first 2 plagues, which were Dam and Sfardeya, he specifically instructed Moshe that Aharon, his brother, would be the one to strike the water of the Nile with his staff. And Dafka, it could not be Moshe Rabbeinu. The answer is why. So I bring for you Rashi over here. Why? Lefi shehegin hayor al Moshe kishenishlach l'socho. Moshe Rabbeinu was saved. His life was saved by the Nile. So it's not proper for Moshe Rabbeinu to be the bringer of a curse to the Nile by turning it into blood or by causing frogs to vomit forth from the Nile. Yeah? So if that's the case, perhaps the Isser of Loeg Larash is a Musar concept. It's a sensitivity issue. That I should not be so callous as to, even if the dead are not aware of what's going on, even if they're totally oblivious and they're long dead and there's no cognizance whatsoever of the dead that are dead and buried, nevertheless, it's insensitive of me to be schlepping around my tzitzis over the tombstones or to be wearing tefillin while walking through a cemetery because it shows a certain lack of refinement, a lack of character, just like if Moshe Rabbeinu were to strike the Nile, even though the Nile doesn't have feelings, bodies of water don't have feelings, yet it would be a chisaron, it would be a deficiency in the character of Moshe to strike the Nile. Do you understand? In other words, that's one way of interpreting the prohibition of Loeg Larash. But there's another way. Yes, Robert?
So why do we keep referencing tzitzis when a mace is buried in Takshikim in Telos anyway? So they had tzitzis.
That's actually a very good point. The poskim discuss whether it's even appropriate to bury a person in tzitzis or not. There are different minhagim as to whether a person should be buried with tzitzis or not, buried with his talis or not. But even those minhagim where a person is buried with his tzitzis, it's not because he has a mitzvah of tzitzis anymore. The dead can't do mitzvahs. Lo hamesim yahalaluka. The dead can no longer praise Hashem. They can no longer serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu by doing bodily commandments. That's the Loeg Larash. Okay? So, again, one way of understanding is that there's a Musar concept here, that it shows a deficiency of character. But the other way of looking at it is that, no, there is an ontological reality that's going on here, that the dead are aware of what's happening, and we are genuinely offending those people who are buried in the cemetery by wearing tefillin and reciting Kriya Shema and wearing tzitzis out and schlepping our tzitzis along in the cemetery. My observation of the Gemara is that it becomes clear, if you understand the Gemara correctly, that it's the latter. It's an ontological reality. That in reality there is a phenomenon going on that by wearing tzitzis out in the cemetery, the Gemara says that this is only problematic. Remember, Rabbi Yonason's whole point was, why should this be a problem? They don't know what's going on. So Rabbi Chia could have said to him, it's not an issue of the awareness of the dead. It's a Musar issue. You're being insensitive. But that's not what Rabbi Chia said. Rabbi Chia said, the dead are aware of what's going on. And the Gemara is clear that the only reason that there's a problem of Loeg Larash is because in reality the dead do know what's going on or can be aware of what's going on. And as a result, a person should not be offensive in their behavior by mocking or showing the dead that I can do a mitzvah that you can no longer do. The question, of course, is why is it necessary to come to that conclusion? Why do we have to come onto that concept that Loeg Larash is usher because of this ontological truth of the awareness of the deceased? Why isn't it sufficient just to say that it's insensitive even if they don't know what's going on? Why can't we say that just like it was inappropriate for Moshe Rabbeinu to strike the Nile, even though the Nile is inanimate and has no feelings or sentience, so too it's insensitive for a person to wear tefillin in a cemetery where the dead can no longer wear tefillin. Yes, Dan.
How do you reconcile that with the medrash of the Ma'amad Yanim Hasadim having a conflict? Do they have, does an inanimate object have feelings or not?
Well, there is a way of, perhaps I misspoke then, perhaps I spoke too soon, perhaps what you're demonstrating from the Midrash is that perhaps you could argue that the Nile does have feelings, just like the Mayim Elyonim and the Mayim Tachtonim when the God makes this rakia, this firmament to divide between upper waters and lower waters, perhaps there is some kind of sentience behind them. So it's a valid point, and the reality is that the way that many of the Meforshim understand midrashim of that genre, like when all the mountains were arguing back, like when our kids learned that all the mountains were arguing which mountain is going to be the mountain that Hashem's going to give the Torah on. So these are all beautiful midrashim that our kids love to hear stories about, and we come, and when they tell us these stories, we nod with approval and with smiles. But then when we think about it, we come to the realization that perhaps this is a metaphor. And so I've always understood midrashim of that genre of being metaphorical in nature, but they don't necessarily have to be. Shivim panim laTorah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because the Rambam says the planets daven, they sing, like they're sentient. So maybe it's not
right. The Rambam refers in that context to celestial bodies,
right,
because he's referring to an Aristotelian concept of the celestial bodies being intelligences. Okay, but that doesn't apply to the things that exist, the chomer, the matter that exists in this world. But perhaps it could, and again, I don't want to negate one interpretation for the sake of the other, but my understanding has always been that it wasn't an issue of actually Moshe Rabbeinu truly offending the Nile, right, or doing something to harm the Nile. The Nile doesn't have feelings. The Nile when it turned into blood, didn't scream in pain, I am turning into blood, right? The Nile is inanimate. The Nile has no feelings, and yet it was wrong for Moshe Rabbeinu to do so. So just the point is that this is not what the Gemara is saying, and my observation is simply this: when it comes to the performance of a mitzvah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu would never give us a mandate to suppress the expression of a mitzvah if it was only for the fulfillment of a Musar precept. In other words, if this is an issue of refinement of character, that's not enough of a reason to tell us not to tuck in your tzitzis, or to not wear your tefillin, or to not recite Kriya Shema. The only reason that we can be exempt from the performance of mitzvahs overtly is if there's an actual reality of us doing something injurious to another party. That's the only time when Chazal would tell us, suspend the performance of a mitzvah overtly because you're actually offending other neshamas that I've created that are going to be hurt by your actions. And therefore, make sure you leave the cemetery before you go ahead. Yeah?
But couldn't the mitzvah be performed at another time? Maybe this is not the negation of the mitzvah. It's just saying that there's an appropriate time to perform mitzvahs and an inappropriate time to perform mitzvahs.
True. Although tzitzis is a mitzvah that applies at all times. That a person, we're basically telling a person to take off your tzitzis or to hide your tzitzis or to remove your tefillin in a time when tefillin was worn the entire day. So Chazal wouldn't tell us to remove our tefillin unless there was an imperative more than just a Musar issue. Because Musar doesn't trump halacha. The only thing that trumps halacha is when we're actually doing something injurious to someone who's real, someone tangible. That's my thesis. You can take it or leave it. I'm just throwing it out. Yeah.
Isn't it possible that because our body creates tumor, so it's simple not a nice way to bear film for people who go through the cemetery?
Oh, I see what you're saying. In other words, you don't want to cause tefillin to come in contact with tumah. Right. That's an interesting point. But we see that the Gemara says not like that. The Gemara's argument is not because of the tumah of the Beis HaKvaros. The Gemara's argument is because it's offensive to the mace. Right. They're not. Our Tashmishe Kedusha. Well, no. Chazal say that Chazal were gozer on Kisvei Kodesh that they are Mekabel Tumah. Right, because of Truma, because of Ochli Truma. But anyway, okay. We're going to see that there are certain circumstances where halachically you're not allowed to recite Kriya Shema, where it's even more serious than this because there's a defilement in the air that precludes you from reciting Kriya Shema. The question is this the same, does this rise to the same level? So we'll see that in just a moment. Now let's get into, so we've talked a little bit about the metaphysics behind this halacha. Let's get into the halacha now. So the first time we find this is in Orachaim Simin Chaf Gimel, in Hilchas Tzitzis. And Sif Aleph says, Mutter likanes beveis hakvaros v'hu lavosh tzitzis. It is permitted to walk into a cemetery wearing tzitzis, v'hu shelo yehi nigrar al hakvaros, provided that they're not schlepping on the tombstones, on the graves themselves. Aval im hu nigrar al hakvaros asu mishum loeg larash. But if they're schlepping, if they're dragging on the graves, then that's offensive, that's loeg larash. So now the Shulchan Aruch qualifies this. This is based on the refinement of the Rishonim. When is this true? That's biyomeihim. That's only in those times of the Gemara. Shahayu matilim tzitzis b'malba shalofshim l'tzarech atzmo. When people wore four-cornered garments as their primary outerwear. In other words, it's not that you put on a talis katan or a talis gadol over your regular garments, but rather your primary garment, your jacket or your shirt, was in itself a four-cornered garment, and that's the garment that you wore. So the reason why there's this distinction between schlepping on the grave and not schlepping on the grave is it's normal to have tzitzis on every garment. So as long as it's not schlepping on the grave, I'm not doing anything that appears to be offensive, because I'm just wearing my garment in the normative garment fashion, okay? So that's why the Gemara makes a point of saying that it's only problematic if it's schlepping. However, but nowadays, when we put on a talis, whether it's a talis gadol or a talis katan under our shirt, the reason why we do it is only exclusively, specifically to fulfill the mitzvah of tzitzis. I'm not putting on a talis to keep myself warm. It's not a fashion statement. It's there exclusively for the performance of a mitzvah. And therefore, asr afilu enam nigrar. And therefore, wearing a talis overtly out in the open is asr, even if the tzitzis are not dragging on the ground or over the tombstone. So you see that the Shulchan Aruch is even more machmir here than from the times of the Gemara, because the way that we wear tzitzis today is different from the way that they wore tzitzis in the times of the Gemara. So certainly to walk in with a talis into a beis hakvaros would be absolutely asr. V'hani mili kishahatzitzios megulim, avalim he mechusim mutar. But it's only prohibited if the tzitzis is out in the open. But if the tzitzis are hidden, then it's okay. Now, what is he referring to? Some, at first face value, might think he's talking about your tzitzis tucked in. No. He's talking about you're wearing a talis gadol, right? But instead of letting the tzitzis hang out, you create a little pocket in each one of the corners of the tzitzis, and you tuck the tzitzios, the tassels, the fringes themselves, into the corners, so that it just looks like you're wearing a four-cornered garment without tzitzis. Then it's permitted to wear a talis gadol and walk into a beis hakvaros. The question then becomes, what's going to be the halacha about wearing a talis katan? I'm going to let you go through the Mishnah Berurah on your own time, but be aware that it would seem to me that we have, based upon the blessing that we have today of B'nai Torah wearing their tzitzis out, which the Mishnah Berurah, the Chafetz Chaim, was a big fan of. The Chafetz Chaim used to say that it's a tremendously great thing to wear your tzitzis out. Why? Because tzitzis is like a medal that was given to you by the king. If the king were to give you a special medal, would you want to conceal it? Would you want to keep it in your pocket so no one can see it? You would proudly display it on your lapel. So why is it, he says, that people wear an undergarment of tzitzis and no one can see the tzitzis that they're wearing? So B'nai Torah today has become a, Baruch Hashem, over the last 20, 30 years, it's become a much more prevalent practice that B'nai Torah walk around with their tzitzis out, right? They walk around with their tzitzis out, right? So the only problem with that is that there's a downside to that. Now that B'nai Torah walk around with their tzitzis out, they have to be especially careful that if they go to a cemetery, or if they're in the proximity of a casket, they have to make sure that they tuck their tzitzis in. Because otherwise there's a problem of loeg larash. That's what it would seem from these halachas, right? Is everyone with me? Okay. Let's go on to source number 4. So I'm just let me just say we're doing the time. Sif Beis of source number 2 back in Siman Chaf Gimel says, Yesh noagim likshor shnei tzitzios shebishnei knafayim zem zeh kishenichnasim lebeis hakvaros v'lo ilu klum b'takanasam. The Shulchan Aruch writes that some people think that it's acceptable in order to obviate the problem of having tzitzis out in the open to tie 2 tassels of the tzitzis together. But he says that doesn't help. The reason is because it's only a temporary sort of annulment of the 4-cornered mitzvah of tzitzis, and because it's only temporary, it doesn't have any reality, it doesn't have any substance halachically, and therefore that's not good enough. And I'll leave Sif Gimel for later. Just one thing that the Mishnah Berurah says over here. He says in Sif Katan Hay, he says that walking within the proximity of a grave, you have an obligation not to wear tzitzis openly. He says, "Va'afilu bekever shel katan yesh lahachmir, mishum loeg larash." This is true even if you're walking by the grave of Nebuch, a child who had passed away at a young age and never had the mitzvah of tzitzis yet. You still cannot walk past him with tzitzis. One could make the halachic argument that it's only loeg larash if a person during his lifetime had the mitzvah and now can no longer do the mitzvah. But what if I'm walking past a small child that never had the mitzvah to begin with, never lived a life where he could fulfill the mitzvah of tzitzis? Maybe there's no isser of loeg larash. So the Mishnah Berurah from the Achronim says, no, there still is an isser of loeg larash because in potentio, that was a human being who had the ability to eventually fulfill the mitzvah of tzitzis, and therefore it is a sense of tragedy or mocking the deceased by saying that I can do the mitzvah and you were not able to do the mitzvah because you died tragically at too young of an age. However, avol bekever isha de bechayeha gam kin petura leka mishum loeg larash. But he says, but this is a distinction, it's drawn by other achronim, that he says, but if you walk past the grave of a woman, right, let's say you walk past the women's section of the cemetery, assuming that there could be a certain cemetery where they make a mechitza not only, on the dance floor, but also in the cemetery, and there's a women's section of the cemetery, then there are cemeteries like that, right? So then it is permitted to walk in the women's section of the cemetery with tzitzis out, because there's no loeg larash, because she never had the mitzvah during her lifetime. So there's nothing offensive. You're not mocking her and saying, ha, I can do the mitzvah and you can't, because she never had the mitzvah to begin with. Clear? Okay. Let's go on to source number 4, which is the next place in Shulchan Aruch where we find this halacha, which is in Hilchas Tefillin. It's in Siman Memhei, where the Shulchan Aruch writes, Asur likones beveis hakvaros besoch arba amos shel meis u'tefillin barasho mishum loeg larash. Once again, you cannot walk into a cemetery if you're wearing tefillin on your head because of loeg larash. However, ve'im hei mechusim, however, if the tefillin are covered, so they're not exposed, so then it's okay. Now here, the Mishnah Berurah has an interesting discussion, quoting a machlokas between the Magen Avraham and the Taz, and in the Bir Halacha he goes into even more detail, suggesting that it's even more complex than just the two-way machlokas between the Magen Avraham and the Taz. However, just for simplicity's sake, let me just point out what the machlokas that the Mishnah Berurah details is as follows. Is the prohibition of loeg larash only within the proximity of the mace itself, with 4 amos within the grave, or is it 4 amos proximal to the Beis HaKfaros? Which means, let's say I'm standing in a place in the cemetery, I go to Bathurst Lawns, and I'm walking down the road, but I'm distant from any kvarim, I'm 4 amos away from any kvarim. Is it okay for me to wear my tzitzis out in that situation, since I'm not within the proximity of a kever, dalet amos, but I'm in the middle of a cemetery? So here the Mishnah Berurah says it's the machlokas between the Magen Avraham and the Taz. The Magen Avraham is machmir, and holds that anywhere in the cemetery, there's an isser of loeg larash, as long as you're within the Beis HaKvaros itself. Even if you're distant from any one particular kever, you're usher to wear tzitzis or tefillin. And the Taz is more mekel, and he says, no, the isser only applies if you have mamish within dalet amos of the mace itself. Mishnah Berurah comes to some level of pshara, and he says as follows. If you're on the periphery of the Beis HaKvaros, and there's a grassy area on the periphery where there are no graves, so then he says it's okay, you can wear your talis and tefillin and do whatever you want, as long as you're Dalet Amos away. But if you're in the center of the Beis HaKvaros, there are kvaros all around you, but nothing within your immediate Dalet Amos, then he says you should be machmir like the Magen Avraham, and you should not do any mitzvahs that could be perceived as loeg l'rush, even if you're more than 4 amos away from any one particular kever. Yeah.
So how do we reconcile Maris Machpelah, Kever Rachel, according to Devin, and some done with tefillin on in the morning, they go, so how do you, that's within proximity.
That's an interesting question as far as the wearing of talis and tefillin in the Maris HaMachpelah. I don't know enough about the logistics of the Maris HaMachpelah to be able
So
to...
within that proximity, just like we said, within that grounds, whether you, the proximity of
Yeah.
you're still within that.
I don't have an answer to that question. It's a good question. I don't know I've never been in the Maris HaMachpelah. As being a Kohen, I'm at a disadvantage. So I don't know how to answer what people do in Maris HaMachpelah. But you can ask an even more basic question. What about the fact that we daven in a Beis HaKvaros? We daven, we say Kaddish, we say
to their benefit or toward
we say tefillas. Okay, good. So that's something that we're going to see qualified later on in the Shulchan Aruch. Let's just go through the sources, okay? So we're going to skip that. I've sort of encapsulated for you sources 5 and 6 in the discussion of this Machlokes Magen Avraham and Mataz. Now let's go on to the next section in Orach Chaim and Shulchan Aruch and Hilchas Kriya Shema. Source number 7, where it's in Siman Ayin Aleph, it's Zayin. Also Likros Kriya Shema Toch Arba Amos Shel Meis, O Beveis HaKvaros. You're not allowed to recite Kriya Shema within the 4 cubits of the decedent or within a cemetery, right? Which sounds like the language of the Magen Avraham. Ve'im kara lo yatsa, and if you recite Kriya Shema, even b'di'evet, if you did it, you're not yotze. So this is an interesting topic, because we know that there are certain instances where if you recite Kriya Shema in an inappropriate environment, you're not yotze Kriya Shema. What is that? For example, if a person recites Kriya Shema in a makom mitunaf, if in a dirty area, let's say there's a baby's got a full diaper, right? And mom's not home, only dad's home, and it says good until 20 pounds. So you figure to yourself, it's good until 20 pounds. What do I have to change the diaper for? Right? That's what it says on the box, right? So what do I need to change them for? The problem is you can't recite Kriya Shema in proximity of the baby's diaper, right? So what happens if you do? So the halacha is that b'di'evet you're not yotze Kriya Shema, and you have to recite it all over again. It sounds like, when just looking at the Shulchan Aruch at face value, that this is the same kind of toxic environment that invalidates the Kriya Shema. But if you at closer analysis, if you take a look at the Mishnah Berurah, he says no, this is only a knas from the Chachamim. Really, midioraisa, you are yotze the mitzvah of Kriya Shema if you recite it in a cemetery, and it's only it's like a mitzvah haba ba'aveira, like you did a mitzvah, but you did an aveira at the same time, but it didn't invalidate the mitzvah. Right? So you were yotze Kriya Shema, you violated a completely separate imperative of loeg l'rush, and the Chachamim said you have to say it again. What's the nafkamina? Why is this relevant? Because what happens if I daven against Shacharis in the Beis HaKvaros? Do I have to go back and recite Birchas Kriya Shema all over again? Nafkamina is going to be that if I wasn't yotze bichlal, so then I have to go ahead and do the Birchas Kriya Shema all over again. If I was yotze technically, but it's Chazal who penalized me and make me say it again, that I wouldn't have to recite Birchas Kriya Shema again. That seems to be the consensus of the poskim, that if you recited Birchas Kriya Shema together with Kriya Shema in a Beis HaKvaros, you only go back and recite the Kriya Shema itself, but you don't say the brachos, because then there's an issue of a bracha levatala. Okay. Let's go now, we shift gears, we go to Yoredeya. Now that we'll go into Hilchas Avelus. So this is source number 9. It says, Lo Yahalech Beveis HaKvaros, really sort of like a repetition of what we've seen so far. A person cannot walk in a cemetery. Everything that The Machaber says in Siman Shin Samech Zayin, Sif Beis in Yoredeya, is really a recap of what he's written in Orach Chaim. However, the Shach over here says, and this is really why I wanted you to see this, that the Shach writes, on this halacha in Siman Shin Samech Zayin in Yoredeya, he says, quoting the Maharshal, Tehu Hadin Kaddish, that when you say the Kaddish at the cemetery, that elongated Kaddish that you say immediately after burial, he says, Tzorech laharchik daled amos. You have to walk 4 amos away from the kever in order to recite the Kaddish properly.
But you're not.
All Kfarim
or just all?
All Kfarim, it seems like, because of Lo Larash.
We're not.
You got to stand on the road.
You're standing right in front of the kever.
You got to stand on the road.
I realize that. I'm just letting you know.
You've just never seen it.
No, I've been to enough.
I mean,
I've
but you're
seen
not.
from
You're standing right, mamish, in front of the kever.
I realize that. I realize that. It
There's
seems
no
like
room. There's no dollar.
it seems like the minhag is not like the shach today, and we'll have to try and understand why the minhag is not like the shach. But it's important to realize that this is something that, and the shach is not. There's no one on the daf itself that contests what the shach says. Take a look at the. We'll continue this discussion. Let's go on to the next section of Shulchan Aruch and Hilchos Avelus. This time from Siman Shin Ayin Vav, Sif Dalid. Says the Shulchan Aruch, Achshav Nohagim, Sha'achar Shenigmar Stimas HaKever Me'afar, that now our minhag is that after we place a layer of earth over the casket, once it's been lowered into the ground, we place a layer of earth, or after the mourner has turned around to walk away from the grave, at that point we instruct the Avel to remove his shoes, and we distance ourselves from the grave, and we say that special extended Kaddish, etc., etc., and then we wash our hands and we go to the shul. So it's not just the shach, this is the Shulchan Aruch itself. Comes along the shach and says on that halach in Siman Shin Ayin Vav, he says, Umarchikin ma'at mi beis hakvaros kidei lomar kaddish lefachos daled amos shameis tofe daled amos. He says you have to be able to say kaddish at least 4 amos away, because the mace has that radius of daled amos wherein you're not allowed to recite kaddish. And that's the Ater Zahav, and that's quoted in the Shem Achronim, the Af L'Kadish Tzarech L'Harchik Daled Amos.
Specifically Loig Larash issue.
This is Loig Larash. Absolutely it's a Loig Larash issue. Yes. Next section in Shulchan Aruch, this is now continuing in Yoredeya Hilchos Avelus. This is Siman Shin Mem Daled, going back a little bit earlier. And he says, Ein Omrim Bifnei Hameis Ela Devarim Shel Meis. Comes along the Shulchan Aruch and tells us an even more broader or general halacha, that if you're in the presence of a corpse, you're only allowed to speak about things that are germane to the decedent, kegon sarche kvuraso vehesped, such as matters relating to the burial and matters relating to the eulogy. Aval sha'ar kol davar asur, but you're not allowed to just talk about the baseball game in the presence of the deceased. V'hani mili b'divrei Torah. He says, Shulchan Aruch says, but that's only true if you're discussing the Torah of baseball, right? In other words, you're only not allowed to share divrei Torah. Aval b'mili dal males lanva. But when it comes to just general mundane affairs, then there's no problem. And what's the reason? So the Shach clarifies. He says, Mishum loig l'rash cherev hoseyu. You're not allowed to share divrei Torah in the presence of a corpse, because there's a problem of loeg l'rash. Just like reciting Kriya Shema is mocking the deceased, so to studying Torah in the presence of the deceased is mocking the deceased, and that's prohibited. So comes along this next part of the Shulchan Aruch, and the same Siman Shin Mem Dalet Sif Yud Zayin, which is the very next sif. He says, however, mutter lomar psukim v'drasha l'chavod hameis. But what you are allowed to do in the presence of the casket is to recite psukim, like Tehillim, and you can give a drasha, you can give a Torah exposition to honor the decedent. V'sochar amosav obeves hakvaros. So explains the Taz in explaining what the words l'chavod hames is to honor the decedent. D'chol she'en l'chavod hames vaday aser. Because if you're not doing it to honor the dead, but you're doing it for some other motive, then it's aser if it's within Dalet Amos of the casket. And the Taz gives a very interesting sort of social commentary at this point. And he says, "V'lo ki yesh shemechavdim laharlos ma'alosam b'drush al hameis, ma she'eno l'chvodo." It's not like we have people who do today, where they call up Rabbi so-and-so, and he gets up and he gives a whole pilpul at the time of the hesped because he can't find enough people to come to a shiur, so he figures, I got a big oilam assembled at the cemetery. I've been dying to give over this chiddush, so let me tell it now when I have a good audience, and I'll relate it. Oh, and he was a good guy too, right? In other words, the Taz says that's wrong. He says because you're not doing it l'chavod hameis, you're doing it l'chvod atzmecha v'lav shopir ka'avdi. And he says this is inappropriate, says the Taz. The shomati harbe gedolim hayu makpidim al davar zeh. And I've taken note of the fact that many gedolei Yisrael have decried this kind of practice where the hespedim become sort of like a tournament of intellect. And that's not correct, he says. That's not, because now you're not doing it out of kavod hameis. Which is, by the way, this is my sort of postscript social commentary to the Taz's social commentary. My objective, and this I have a Kabbalah from my Rabbi, is my objective in giving a hesped is not to give over divrei Torah. In my opinion, the purpose of the hesped is not to be an educational experience about some vort on the parsha or some kind of explanation of a Gemara or Medrash. The point of a hesped is to try and to encapsulate the life of the decedent in some touching way, which will stir the hearts of the people who are listening. If you can get in a pasuk or something like that which is germane in some way, fine, but that's not my objective. You don't get more points the more divrei Torah you give at a hesped. There's a place for giving over divrei Torah, but a hesped is not. That's not the primary objective. Yes.
If I understand you correctly, Lechvod HaMei, it's okay to say Tehillim. Do I understand it correctly?
Exactly. Yes.
So let's just generalize. If it's Lechvod HaMei, it's okay to say Tehillim. Why couldn't you argue that wearing tzitzis and wearing tefillin in the kever is also Lechvod HaMei?
Because it's not.
Who's making the judgment that it's mocking the mace? I mean, we're
Well, it's not. The judgment is that you're doing an act that only the living can do, and as a result, it's not. We're not saying that that's your motive for doing it. Your motive for doing it is because you want to do the mitzvah. But the very fact that you're proximal to someone who can't do the mitzvah is what the Gemara says is incorrect. You're not supposed to do that, right? The only dispensation is that you can recite psukim if you're doing it to honor the decedent. But I don't think you can make the argument that wearing tefillin is out of honor, because there's no connection between your tefillin and the person who's lying here in the casket. Now, just let me continue. I think that even though the Shach is quite clear, and the Shulchan Aruch is quite clear, that when it comes to saying the Kaddish, you must distance yourself Dalet Amos from the kever. Perhaps, and again, I don't have clarity on this point, but perhaps the reason why some people, and this seems to be the prevalent practice, is to be liberal and allow people to recite the Kaddish immediately at graveside, is because this is also L'chavod Hames, or it's perceived as L'chavod Hames. Now, the truth is that Kaddish also provides consolation and comfort to the Avel. And from that perspective, one should argue that you should have to distance yourself from the kever. So it would seem to me that if you are going to recite Kaddish at the graveside, you would have to sort of try and focus your energy and say that there's no personal objective here that I'm trying to garner from saying the Kaddish, but rather I say it to show exclusively only to show kavod to the person that is being buried at this time.
But isn't that the nature of Kaddish?
There's more than one function of Kaddish. There are multiple functions of Kaddish. So you'd have to sort of muster that kind of focus and say this is exclusively for the mace. It's got nothing to do with me, or nothing for the fulfillment of the mitzvah of being Makadeshim Shemaim through the recitation of Kaddish. I'm conjecturing here. I'm a little bit, I have to confess that I'm not really comfortable with this. How much is Dalet Amos? It's about 6 to 8 feet.
He may be 6 feet away.
All right. Anyway, take a look at the Birkei Yosef on Yoredei Siman Shin Mem Dalet, and then we're going to get, after we do this, we'll do quickly two tshuvas. He says, V'hein od hayom hachi nahug berov tfutzos Yisrael. He says, the Birkei Yosef, commenting on the Shulchan Aruch, says, this is currently the minhag that we have in most Jewish communities. Hein lidrosh b'fnei hameis ve'al hakever. We give eulogies at the funeral. We give eulogies at graveside. Hein lilmod al hakever lemenuchaso. We even study sometimes by the grave so that the person should have some kind of respite or menucha, not like it was indicated before to not study Torah. Right? V'chein ra'isi shekasav hatayar hagadol hadradvaz b'tshuvas hachadash siman reish chavdal v'zelashono, quoting from the great Radvaz, who says that Ulinin Mishadarish al Hames Lefanav Nir Delekal Amechash Mishim Loig Larash Kevin de Lechvodo Ka'avid. The Radvaz concurs and he says that if you're giving a hesped, if you're giving a eulogy with lots of divrei Torah, as long as it's for the kavod of the mace, it's perfectly okay and there's no problem of Loig Larash. And there's a proof the Radvaz wants to bring from a Gemara in Bava Kama which talks about Chizkiyahu HaMelech. It says that when Chizkiyahu HaMelech died, Shehoshivu Yeshiva al Kivro, that they set up a yeshiva, a group of students to study by his kever, in his honor. So you see that because it was out of his honor, they did it not because they wanted to garner any benefit for themselves, but they did it for his sake. Therefore, it was considered to be not the problem of loig l'rush. Interesting enough, the Birkei Yosef challenges the Radvaz's diuk, but just wanted you to see that Birkei Yosef. So comes along the Maharsham, Rav Shalom Shwadron, in the early 20th century. He died shortly before World War I, and he writes in following tshuva. The reason why this tshuva caught my eye is because it discusses a practice that I have never heard of before in my life. And I actually asked a few other rabbis, have you ever heard of the practice that the Maharsham says was widespread in Europe at the time? No one that I've spoken to has ever heard of it. He says, Va'al derech she'elaso la'asher nifratz bi'iro chalo as yoladim rachmana litzlan. He says, the questioner asked the following sheila. The sheila was, in our community, Nebuch, there's been a rash of deaths of children recently because of some kind of plague or illness. Who knows what it was? Diphtheria, measles, whatever. Who knows what it was before the age of antibiotics? Many times you would have a whole group of children, Nebuch, dying at one time in the shtetl. And they were things that people took upon themselves to be able to try and create a kapara so that the deaths should stop. Umorgol bein hahamon sgula. He says there's a commonly practiced sgula. Lahamid chuppah shel yasam v'yasama beveis hakvaros. What they do is, the community takes upon themselves to underwrite the wedding of a yasam and a yasama, of two orphans who can't afford to get married, in order to atone for, sort of try to bring for a penance for the community. And to stop the plague, what they do is that they marry off a yasam and a yasama, and they do so in a cemetery. And I was scratching my head, why would they do that in a cemetery? Perhaps maybe they do it in the presence of the deceased, because maybe the deceased are the ones, perhaps maybe they're the cause of why these terrible calamities are happening, because we're not following in their footsteps. And perhaps if we go to the cemetery of our Babis and Zaydis and we show them that we're still continuing the acts of chesed that they taught us, maybe that'll bring about an abatement of whatever suffering our community is going through. That's the only thing that I can think of. But that was, says the Maharsham, it was a widespread practice in Europe that this is what people would do. And the question that was presented to the Maharsham was, he says that several weeks ago, they made a Beis HaKvaros where they didn't, and in a corner of the Beis HaKvaros, they didn't bury anyone because they specifically designated a corner of the Beis HaKvaros. It was the chuppah garden of the cemetery, specifically for this purpose. V'gam kvar kavru sham kama mesim ubanu saviv ha-mechitzos aval ligmeru ha-mechitzos od saviv rak berov ha-makamos kvar mekif mechitzos. He says we have a new cemetery, and a corner of it is set aside for this chuppah, and we've already buried a lot of people in the cemetery, and we want to know, and we already have a wall around the cemetery. We have the following shaila. V'hinei chasan hayosim hu kohen. So the chasan that we want to marry off is a kohen, and the question is as follows: is he allowed to go and have his chuppah in the cemetery on the grassy area where there are no kvaros? And the shaila is twofold. The shaila that brought the Marsham's question is, it's in the walls of the cemetery, but it's distant Dalet Amos from any kvaros. And he says that one of the Rabbanim of the Shtat wanted to say that it's usher for two reasons. Number one, because the brachos that you're going to be reciting, the Sheva brachos, that you're saying under the chuppah, is a problem of loeg Larash. That's one reason, he says. And number two, you have to worry about maybe they were buried there nefalim. Maybe there were miscarried fetuses that were buried in that area, even though there's no markers and there's no graves. But a lot of times they bury miscarried fetuses on the periphery of the cemetery to honor the fetuses and to give them a proper burial, because they have the neshama, or at least they have some semblance of the neshama, and therefore we want to give them a proper burial. And maybe they're buried there, so you have to be choshesh that maybe there's tumah there as well. So the Maharsham goes through to explain why he thinks that it is still mutter, using the following two arguments. Number one, as far as the Isser of Loeg Larash, the only one who holds that if you're inside the cemetery and you're still far away, Dalet Amos, from the Mason, and still problematic of Loeg Larash, he says that's the Magen Avraham. And a lot of people don't paskin like the Magen Avraham. It's not so machmir. And certainly if it's on the outskirts, if it's on the periphery of the cemetery, he feels that it's justifiable. And number two, as far as the concern that maybe there are nefalim, he says it's safek tumah b'reshus harabim. He says at best it's only a safek tumah. It's in a public domain. And we know the general principle from the Gemara that safek tumah b'reshus harabim sveiko tar. That you don't have to be choshesh for safek tumah in reshus harabim. It's only in reshus hayachid. So since this is a public domain and it's only a safek tumah, you're allowed to be mekel. B'didi hava uvda, when I was a rav in Allentown, Pennsylvania, there is a cemetery that the shul has, and there, at least when I was there was an entire area at one corner of the cemetery where there were no graves. We trimmed back all the trees, and when someone did not want to have a chapel a funeral ceremony, but they wanted to have something graveside, we would erect a sort of a canopy in that area for people to sit down, and then we would have I would speak in that corner, and then people would proceed to the graveside, and they would proceed with the interment at that point. So that was the way that we did it. What about the fact that there may be nefalim buried in that corner and there's no marker? Safek tumah b'reshus harabim mistar. You don't have to be choshesh for nefalim. Okay. And then finally, take a look at an interesting tshuva from Reb Moshe. This is an Igros Moshe Yoredei Chela Gimel Siman Kuf Yud Zayin. The following shaila was brought to him. He says, "Uvadavar imutar lichtov misparim ala kvarim mamash kedei sheyuchlu limtso makom hakever ben akel." This is a common issue. If you're a cemetery maintenance worker, one of the biggest issues that you have is with record keeping. You have some of these mega cemeteries, like you go to Queens, New York, right? They say that there are more dead people in Queens than there are living people. And that's not an exaggeration, because some of the cemeteries are massive in size. It's, I guess, where all of A lot of the Jews are buried in Queens, right? So if you go to one of these massive cemeteries, how do the maintenance people know where to locate all of the cemeteries? So one of the suggestions that was raised to Rav Moshe is, are we allowed to paint numbers on the tombstones themselves in order to sort of like have an address for each cemetery? We would have a numbering system to go up and down like streets, like we have on houses. Is it okay to do that for the cemetery as well? For each tombstone. And we put a number. And he says, Imhu zilzul lahamesim, is this considered to be a desecration of the dead? Shenoagin bahen kemo babatim, that you're treating the deceased like a house, right? You're putting like an address on him, just like you would put on your home. So that could be in some way, that doesn't sound right. That was the basis of the question. Lo Allah bizichrone mehasfarim sheraisi sheyadunu b'nidon kazeh. So first Rav Moshe says, I've never run across this shaila. I don't remember ever coming across this shaila ever being addressed in earlier Sfarim. He says, it could be because the methods of burial in the shtetl in Europe were that every community had a small cemetery. You didn't have these massive cemeteries like you had today in New York, right? He says, I also don't really have a frame of reference where I can draw from any analogies that I can think of offhand. One thing I do know, he says, is that it's usher to count Jews. We know you're not allowed to count Jews. He says, we know, you know the famous halacha that when you want to know if you have a minyan, you don't say 1, 2, 3, 4, you say Oshia Samecha, you figure out a way of counting without appointing numbers to any individual. And he says, the reason why it's okay to put a number on your house is because that's not counting people. Because there could be multiple people in any one house. So therefore, that's not a halachic problem to have an address with a number on your house. That's okay. But he says over here, it's one person per tombstone. So it could be more problematic to put a number on the tombstone because that could be like counting Yiddelach. And therefore, and so he goes through the whole discussion. And Rav Moshe therefore gives an eitzah in order, he says, it could be a problem of loig larash. Why is it a problem of loig larash? He says, because when they're alive, you're not allowed to count them. It's when they're dead, you can put a number on their tombstone. You're actively demonstrating that the halachas that apply to the living do not apply to the dead. So that, in a sense, is the loig larash issue. And therefore Rav Moshe is sensitive to this in his godless. And he therefore wants to suggest that while he cannot sanction putting an individual number on every kever, what he does recommend is having sections of the cemetery, where you divide the cemetery like we do today. You divide the cemetery into sections, and you can put numbers on the sections. So you could have, let's say, 100 graves in one section, call that section 42A, right? And then you have a database or index cards or a file cards that tell you all the people that are buried in section 42A. Right? That, he says, you could do as long as you don't assign a 1-to-1 ratio between a number and the deceased individual. He says then it would be okay. But if once you assign a 1-to-1 ratio of a number for each person, then he feels that there's a problem of loig larash. Okay, any questions? Any remaining questions?
So what's the practicality of the 4 ounces, 6 to 8 feet?
What? Yeah.
I mean, in most, like say for example, you go to Party Shalom. You want to say Tehillim for a parent, which I presume is
Tehillim is okay.
Yeah,
Tehillim is okay.
But you back away 6 feet from your parents' graves.
No, it's not necessary. We said that if it's
Tehillim is okay.
We said if you're saying tefillah out of respect for the dead, then it's okay.
But the burial, again, is the same problem.
The only thing that we saw from the Shulchan Aruch and the Shach is that when it comes to saying only the Kaddish The Shach and the Shulchan Aruch feel you have to distance yourself Dalet Amos. We pointed out that seems to be not the prevalent practice today. And in trying to understand the reason why, it would seem to me because people do it L'chvod HaMeis as well. That's the only thing that I can come up with. So.
The discussion in the Gemara continues with Shema during the Shura. Talks about saying Shema in the Shura. So, but today also we make the Shura right to the kever. We don't make it outside. It seems
That's true. That's true. The practice in the times of the Gemara was that sometimes a kever would be isolated. It wouldn't necessarily be in an entire Beis HaKvaros. It could be that the Shura was berichuk Dalet Amos, and therefore the Mishnah says that if you can say all of Kriya Shema from the time that you get, or at least a portion of Kriya Shema from the time that you leave the kever to the time that you get to the Shura, then you can say it. Yeah. Okay.